In 2021, in a small town in Connecticut, an old man gave his daughter a wooden box before he died. He handed it to her quietly. No explanation. No long speech. The box had only 3 things inside: a diary, some old photographs, and a sealed envelope with 4 words written on the front: "Open this when I'm gone." The man's name was Harold Mercer. He was 81 years old. For most of his life he was an antique dealer. But not just any antique dealer. Harold specialized in one specific thing: mirrors made before 1880. He had not shown that box to anyone for 35 years, not his wife, not his friends, not his colleagues. And when his daughter Clara Mercer finally opened that envelope after his funeral, what she found inside did not just answer questions. It raised ones that nobody had been asking. Harold opened his shop in 1986. He called it Mercer Antiques. It was on a quiet street in Hartford, Connecticut. The shop was small. Wooden floors, old shelves, a smell of dust and history. But in the back room, Harold kept something special. Rows of mirrors. Each one wrapped carefully in cloth. Each one made before 1880. People who visited the shop always asked the same question: why only old mirrors? Why not furniture, or paintings, or other antiques? Harold always gave the same answer: because these mirrors are different from everything else. He never said more than that. Customers assumed he was just a passionate collector with a strange focus. Nobody pushed further. But Harold had a reason. A very specific reason. And it started in 1989. But in the spring of 1989, a man walked into Mercer Antiques. His name was Father Thomas Beaumont. He was a Catholic priest at a small church in Hartford. He was soft-spoken, polite. He looked around the shop for a while before asking Harold about the mirrors in the back room. Harold showed him the collection. Father Beaumont looked at each one carefully. Then he stopped at a specific mirror. It was made in 1871. The brass plate on the back read, R. Hutchins, Boston. Father Beaumont bought it that same day. 3 weeks later, he came back. Harold noticed immediately that something was wrong. Father Beaumont's face was pale. His hands were not steady. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. Harold asked, "Is something wrong with the mirror? Do you want a refund?" Father Beaumont shook his head. He sat down. He took a slow breath. Then he said, "I am seeing something in that mirror that I cannot explain." Harold waited. Father Beaumont continued, "In the mornings, when the light comes through the window at a low angle, I walk past the mirror and I do not see my reflection. I see a building, an enormous building, white stone, a large dome on top, columns at the entrance." Harold said nothing. Father Beaumont leaned forward. His voice dropped lower. "And on the door of that building, there are symbols carved into the stone. I have seen those exact symbols before, in documents that are kept locked inside our church archives. Documents that are over 200 years old. Documents that almost nobody is allowed to see."
Harold asked Father Beaumont directly, "What are those documents?" Father Beaumont explained that he did not work only as a priest. He also worked inside the Historical Records Department of the Connecticut Diocese. His job was to organize and preserve old documents. Most of what he handled was routine: old church records, baptism registers, property documents. But deep inside the archive there was a locked section. Very few people had access to it. In 1990, Father Beaumont used his access to bring Harold a photocopy of one specific document. It was written in 1812. An internal memo sent between senior church officials, written in Latin. Father Beaumont had translated it himself. Harold read the translation slowly. It said, "These structures are not to be discussed in public. Their origin is not known to us. We did not build them. We inherited them. The symbols carved on the interior walls are not Christian in origin. They appear to be significantly older. It has been decided that these symbols will be removed wherever this is possible. These buildings will be given new histories. Their true origins will not be recorded." Harold put the paper down. He sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked, "This memo was written in 1812. That means these buildings were already standing before 1812. Father Beaumont nodded. "Not just before 1812, he said. "Based on what else I have found, these buildings were already old in 1812. We are not talking about a few decades. We are talking about something much older." After that meeting, Harold began thinking differently about the mirrors in his back room.
He already knew one thing that most people did not. Mirrors made before 1880 were produced using a method called mercury silvering. Today's mirrors use aluminum or silver on the back of the glass. The reflection is sharp, clean, and almost perfectly accurate. But before 1880, mirror makers used liquid mercury. The process was slower, less precise. The glass itself often contained small impurities. The result was a mirror that did not reflect perfectly. There was a slight softness to the image, a quality that felt different. Some researchers had a theory about these impurities. They believed the mercury and the glass impurities together created a kind of recording surface. When these mirrors were installed inside a building, they slowly absorbed the visual environment around them, the architecture, the light, the details of the space. Over decades, under the right conditions, those absorbed images could become visible again. Not always. Not for everyone. Only under specific circumstances. A specific angle of light, a specific temperature, a specific time of day. Harold thought about this for a long time. If these mirrors recorded what they saw when they were first made and installed, then what had his mirrors seen? And more importantly, where had they been installed before they ended up in his shop? Harold spent the next 2 years going through historical records of Connecticut. He visited local libraries. He requested access to municipal archives. He looked through hundreds of old photographs. What he found was deeply strange. In photographs of Hartford from the 1860s and 1870s, there were buildings that simply do not exist today. Large buildings, beautiful buildings. Structures with massive white stone columns, large domes, and arched windows that reached 3 or 4 stories high. The official records for almost all of these buildings said the same thing. Demolished. Between 1890 and 1930. The stated reason was always practical. The city needed space. New roads were being built. The land was needed for modern development, but Harold kept noticing something that did not add up. When these grand buildings were torn down, what replaced them was almost always much smaller and much simpler. A 6-story neoclassical building with a stone dome gets demolished. In its place goes a 2-story brick office. That is not development. That is replacement, and expensive replacement at that. Demolishing a massive stone structure costs enormous amounts of money. You would only do it if making space was not the real goal. Harold started to believe the real goal was something else entirely. Not to build something new, to make people forget what had been there before. In 1993, Father Beaumont called Harold. The call was urgent. He had gone deeper into the locked section of the archives, and he had found something that changed everything he thought he understood. When they met, Father Beaumont spread several photocopied pages on the table between them. They were property records from the early 1800s. Over and over, in record after record, the same phrase appeared. Building received by donation. Church properties across Connecticut and in neighboring states had been received as donations. No names were recorded for the donors. No background information. No explanation of origin. Just buildings, already standing, already finished, transferred to the church with no documented history. And once the church received these buildings, they followed the same pattern every time. New crosses were installed. Old symbols on the walls were removed or painted over. New names were assigned. And the buildings were recorded in church documents as if the church had always owned them or built them. Father Beaumont said, "I have found 14 properties in Connecticut alone that follow this exact pattern. 14 buildings with no recorded origin that were absorbed into church records with completely new histories." Harold asked the question he had been thinking about for years. Where do you think these buildings actually came from? Father Beaumont was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know the full answer. But I can tell you that the symbols which were removed from those buildings, I have seen similar symbols in one other place." Harold waited. "In old maps," Father Beaumont said. "Maps from the 1700s and early 1800s. Maps that show a civilization labeled as Tartaria." Harold had heard the word Tartaria before. He had seen it mentioned in a few old reference books. He had never taken it seriously. After that meeting with Father Beaumont, he did. Tartaria appears on European maps from the 1600s, 1700s, and into the early 1800s. It is labeled as a vast region stretching across northern and central Asia. Official history treats it as nothing more than a geographic label, a vague term for an unsettled region. But Father Beaumont showed Harold the 1875 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. The entry for Tartaria in that edition was detailed. It described cities. It described trade routes. It described a system of government. It listed population estimates and cultural practices. This was not how encyclopedias described empty geographic regions. This was how they described civilizations. Then, Harold looked at the 1910 edition of the same encyclopedia. The entry was almost completely gone. Not shortened. Not updated. Almost entirely removed. A civilization documented in detail in 1875 had effectively vanished from the historical record. By 1910, Harold thought about the Roman Empire. It ended over 1,500 years ago. Historians still write entire books about it. Tartaria was being referenced in encyclopedias less than 150 years ago. And today most people have never heard the name. That kind of erasure does not happen naturally. In 1995, a new customer came into Harold's shop. He was a professor of history at Yale University. He bought a mirror from 1868, made in New Haven. 2 months later, he returned. He was not asking for a refund. He was carrying a notebook. He told Harold that he had been seeing symbols appear in the mirror, symbols carved or painted onto the walls of buildings visible in the reflection. Every time the image appeared, he sketched as many symbols as he could before it faded. The notebook contained roughly 150 distinct symbols. Harold looked through them carefully. Then he brought Father Beaumont to see them. Father Beaumont went completely still when he saw the sketches. He said quietly, "These are the same ones. These are the symbols from the original walls. The ones that were removed." The professor had already spent weeks trying to identify the symbols. He had compared them to dozens of ancient writing systems. None matched exactly. But there were strong similarities with Old Turkish and Sogdian script. Both are ancient writing systems from Central Asia. Both from the same region that old maps label as Tartaria. Those sketches circulated briefly in academic circles. Then, they quietly disappeared. The professor told Harold later that he had been advised by colleagues to drop the subject entirely. He took that advice. By 1997, Harold had 9 customers who had reported seeing unusual reflections in their mirrors. An architect, a structural engineer, a retired university professor, several others. All of them described similar scenes. Wide open streets paved in white stone, large buildings with domed roofs and tall columns, clean air, and somewhere in the distance a large structure that could not quite be identified. Harold had been conducting his own quiet experiments for years, setting mirrors at different angles, testing different lighting conditions, keeping logs of temperature and humidity. Then one morning in the autumn of 1997, he finally saw it himself. The temperature was 61 degrees. Humidity was around 70%. The early morning sun came through the window at a low angle and hit the surface of a mirror made in 1876. Harold did not see his back room. He saw a wide plaza. The ground was paved with large white stones. Tall buildings with columns stood on every side. A fountain stood in the center of the plaza. Beyond it, a long tree-lined boulevard stretched into the distance. And at the far edge of what he could see, barely visible through the morning mist, there was a structure, large, pyramid-shaped. Its surface was catching the light and reflecting it in a way that made it shimmer. Harold stood there for just over 2 minutes. Then he reached for his camera. The moment he moved, the image vanished. His back room reflected back at him as normal. He tried again the next morning, and the morning after that. It never came back. Harold wrote about what happened next in his diary. It was the part Clara found most difficult to read. In early 1996, about a year before he closed the shop, Harold received an unannounced visit. A man arrived at Mercer Antiques, well-dressed, calm, professional. He introduced himself as a senior administrator from the Connecticut diocese. He said he had heard that some of Harold's customers were reporting unusual experiences with the mirrors. He said the church was aware of these reports, and then he said the church would prefer that Harold not discuss these reports publicly. Harold asked why. The man explained that the experiences were almost certainly caused by optical defects in old glass. The mercury silvering process was known to create visual distortions under certain lighting conditions. There was nothing supernatural happening. If these stories spread publicly, they could cause unnecessary concern. Harold listened carefully. Then, he asked one more question. Who exactly would be concerned if this became public? The man smiled. He stood up. He put on his coat. As he reached the door, he turned back and said, "Some things are historically sensitive, Mr. Mercer. Some doors are better left closed." Harold wrote in his diary. I asked him one last question. I said, "Closed for whose benefit?" He did not answer. He just smiled again and left. That was the last time anyone from the church contacted me. But it was enough. I understood what he meant. And I understood what I needed to do. 1 year later, Harold closed the shop. He wrapped his remaining mirrors. He put them in storage. He sealed the box. And he waited. When Clara opened her father's box in 2021, she spent 3 days reading everything before she made a single phone call. Then she contacted Dr. Maria Reyes, a professor of architectural history at the University of Connecticut. She brought Dr. Reyes the full diary, all the photographs, and all the photocopied documents from Father Beaumont. Dr. Reyes took 3 weeks to go through everything properly. When she came back to Clara, her conclusion was careful but clear. She said, "I cannot tell you what your father saw in those mirrors. I cannot explain the reflections, but I can tell you this. I have identified 11 structures in Connecticut's historical records from the 1800s that match the architectural descriptions in this diary. 8 of those 11 are listed as demolished between 1890 and 1935. 3 were repurposed. In all 3 repurposed buildings, the original foundations are still in place today. But the upper structures have been completely rebuilt." Clara asked, "Does that mean my father was right?" Dr. Reyes paused for a long moment. "It means," she said slowly, "that the buildings which stood in this region were significantly grander than what our official historical records suggest. And their removal happened very quickly and very deliberately. Someone wanted them gone. And someone wanted people to stop asking why." The final page of Harold Mercer's diary had only a few short paragraphs. He wrote, "I don't know who built these buildings. I don't know how the mirrors capture what they capture. I don't know exactly what the church knew or how long they have known it. But I know one thing with complete certainty. There are people who are very comfortable with the story the world currently believes. And every time someone gets close to a different story, something happens to stop them. A visit, a warning, a smile at the door. I kept this box hidden for 35 years, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I understood that information has more power at the right moment. My moment has passed. Clara's is just beginning. Clara is still looking into it. Dr. Reyes's research is ongoing, and in Connecticut today, 3 old buildings are still standing. Their upper walls have been rebuilt and renovated many times over the decades. But their foundations have never been touched. Nobody has ever been able to explain who laid them, or when, or why they are built the way they are. If you have a mirror in your home that was made before 1880, check the back for a brass plate, look for a maker's name and a date. And if one morning or one evening that mirror shows you something that does not match the room around you, write it down. Every detail. Every time, because some mirrors do not only reflect what is in front of them, they remember what was there before.